So what does IDU stand for? Well, it stands for I don't understand, because that's that's the core of the feeling that you have when you're confronted with any form of bias, but in particular unconscious bias in relation to race or any other ism, if you like. And when you think about it, when you're on the receiving end of unconscious bias, you tend to think, I don't understand why this person was like that. I just can't understand that they can't see that this was so insensitive. I really don't understand why they can't see I'd be offended by that. I really don't understand why they didn't choose me for that project. I really don't understand why I wasn't in the running for that job. These are the questions that you tend to ask. I really don't understand why they were so offensive. I really don't understand why somebody who's so nice could be so evil at the same time. These are the questions that you ask. And what I'm talking about in IDU is why call it in and have those negative internal feelings, those circular questions, when you can call it out. Now, the key is, how do you call it out? And that's what IDU is all about. Next. So why and how did you come up with the methodology? Well, again, another good question. There are a couple of reasons why I came up with a methodology. Firstly, from a personal perspective, every now and then I would come across racial bias. Sometimes it's very subtle, and it obviously didn't have a massive impact on me because I've got a lot of business in the sectors that I work in. However, it was always there from time to time, and I would always struggle as to how to deal with it. So I was racking my brain for years, looking to see if I could find a way in which I could somehow deal with this bias. And the only thing that I could come up with was to call it out. But of course, you don't want to call it out because of the defensive fragility that you would come up against from the person or persons that you're calling it out to. So that was the first reason. The second reason is I've been exposed to unconscious bias training in the past. And what I've always found is that it tends to focus on the victim and victimhood and being sensitive to victims of unconscious bias. And how, if you're more sensitive to that, that awareness will impact the way that you behave. However, not enough attention, in my opinion, is allocated to equipping people to navigate unconscious bias on their own. Yeah, so empowering them to navigate unconscious bias in a way which doesn't invoke defensive fragility, but allows them to move on beyond it and continue their careers, as opposed to having to deal with it and stifling their careers. So this was really important to me. So I wanted to come at this from a place where I could give people skills that they could use to navigate unconscious bias on a day-to-day basis in the moment, so that they can move on. And so that was the second reason. And then the third reason is just generally with diversity and inclusion solutions, I found that they were split up into or created a paradigm focused around guilty perpetrator and hapless victim. And I felt that this paradigm wasn't useful in terms of helping people deal with unconscious bias. In fact, the guilt paradigm, and maybe we'll talk about this later, the guilt paradigm was like I compare it to a nice glass of colorful Kool-Aid, which looks really nice initially and makes you really feel good and everybody feel better. And we all drink it. But at the end of it, there's a bitter aftertaste. And the bitter aftertaste is that it reinforces the problem that it was trying to correct in the first place. And from a victim perspective, they remain a victim. So I wanted to get away from this guilty perpetrator and hapless victim model. And this was one of the ways in which I felt we could definitely do that. So, okay, yeah, great question. So we're on to this now. What are guilt-driven initiatives? Well, guilt-driven initiatives come from a place of guilt. That is, I feel so bad. Management feels so bad. Everything that's happened in the past, all the bad things that have happened in the past due to Well, any number of things: 400 years of slavery, colonization, systemic racism. These things are drive initiatives. And when we come from a place of guilt, the problem with that is that there can only be one. There can only be a victim at the end of that. So you have this guilt, guilty perpetrator, and the hapless victim. And I think solutions that come from that perspective always treat the subject of unconscious bias as a victim. And if you're treated like a victim, you're creating a polarization. You're saying that there's this type of person and there's this type of person. And you're dealing with the issue unilaterally. It's like us in senior management are going to make things better for this guilty person. For this victim. Whereas I don't think that that is the best way or best model to shift the balance in terms of fairness. And so guilt-driven initiatives, for me, don't represent the way forward. Resentment-driven initiatives are the second type of initiative that I've seen, second type of diversity and inclusion initiative that I've seen, which again, I think are pointless. And the reason why I think these are pointless is because as a base, they come from a place of annoyance or defensive fragility. That is, if anybody raises anything to do with unconscious bias, we tend to, or those people that come from a resentment, who resent it, tend to get their back up. And even if you just remotely make reference to unconscious bias, in particular, racial bias is probably one of the most strongest biases, and it drives the biggest emotions in people, negative emotions and defensive emotions. And when you come from that perspective in terms of trying to sort out, trying to address unconscious bias, what you end up doing is a tick box exercise, which just shows that you've done something. And that doesn't really help anybody, because again, you're just doing it so that you can keep everybody quiet and to allay a smidgen of guilt that you have. But also what it does, it creates a them and us scenario. These are the complaining ethnic minorities, for example, or the complaining women, or the complaining disabled, or the complaining LGBTQ, or complaining BAME people. Let's just do something for them and then we can get on with our day, make money and run our businesses. So that type of initiative, even though that might have been extreme the way I explained it, really doesn't work. And it just causes more resentment and increases the disparity as opposed to the opposite. Atonement-driven solutions, atonement-driven initiatives. Now, this is all about us saying sorry. We feel guilty, and we need to address that. We need to atone for the sins, so to speak, that we've committed to the ethnic minorities, to people with disabilities, to people of the opposite sex, primarily women. And I could go on the different isms, but atonement is about addressing that. And then it's also about us who tend to be subjects of unconscious bias saying, right, yeah, we need to get together with management. We need and put together a plan which is going to atone for all that was done wrong in the past. The problem with these types of initiatives and solutions is that they lead to one place, and that's sustaining this guilty perpetrator and hapless victim model. They don't allocate, if any, attention to equipping people, empowering subjects with the skills, the ability to handle and navigate unconscious bias themselves. And as a result, they become pointless too. And they often lead to resentment, because after a while, people get tired of atoning for sins which they don't feel that they've actually done. And they get tired. The victims feel let down, having relied on this atonement. And then you're back again to the issue of having no inclusion or not enough inclusion. So this is a vicious circle, which in my mind goes nowhere. What are fairness-driven inclusion initiatives? Yeah, so fairness-driven inclusion initiatives are my favorite. These are equity-driven. This is all about fairness. You're not doing the initiative because you want to change the world or make the world a better place. You're not doing the initiative because you feel guilty and that you should do it. You're exercising or you're implementing these initiatives because it's the right thing to do. And when you come from that perspective, you're less likely to have this, be drinking this guilt Kool-Aid that we all tend to drink when we implement these initiatives. When you come from a place of fairness, a place of equity, you just do things because they're the right thing to do. And if that's what's driving your decisions, if that's what's driving your unconscious bias related solutions, you're going to find that you're not going to come at it from a guilty perpetrator perspective, which isn't good for you, or you collectively as a management team or as an individual. And you're not going to treat the subjects as hapless victims. And they too will stop feeling like victims. And if they stop feeling like victims and we stop feeling, or management stop feeling guilty, then we can all collaborate and win together. And this drives productivity and increases effectiveness in terms of dissipating and getting rid of unconscious bias. Because the whole premise of this is let's allocate equal opportunity. Let's allocate time to equipping people with the skills, with the initiative to deal with unconscious bias so that they don't need to rely on the perpetrator, in inverted commas, and they stop being victims and stop being subjects and they just become leaders and in control. What is reverse bias? That's a biggie. And you know, how many people have fallen foul to this? Well, I can say I have. And this is where you sense that somebody is consciously coming from a place of bias or unconsciously coming from a place of bias in relation to your race, your sexuality, your sexual preference, your physical disability, if you have one, all of these and other areas, your age. All of these represent paranoia, understandable paranoia, by the way, in terms of the other side, the other party, the unconscious perpetrator, exerting a bias on you, which is going to impact your career. That's what I mean by reverse bias. So in a sense, it turns the perpetrator into a victim and the traditional subject into the perpetrator. And the challenge with this is that the manager, for example, in this type of situation, normally in many cases just doesn't call it out. What they'll do is be annoyed by it, keep it in, and maybe talk to somebody else. But you know what? That creates equal amounts of tension to what the victim would normally feel when they're on the receiving end of unconscious bias. So I think what we all need to do is find a way of calling bias out, which doesn't invoke defensive fragility on either side. And being aware of reverse bias is one way of doing that. The other way is those who are the subject of reverse bias, they must call it out, which is a big theme in the whole IDU methodology. What is DDE? Yes, now good question. When it comes to calling out unconscious bias, DDE is your recipe for success. DDE stands for dispassionate developmental inquiry. Dispassionate developmental inquiry. And what that means is that when you're confronted with unconscious bias or reverse bias, what you must do is call it out. The question is, how do you call it out? And what I'm suggesting is if you come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry, you will avoid invoking the kind of defensive fragility that we're used to when we accuse somebody of something which is so heinous. They feel they have to stand up for themselves and come back at us, almost like saying, how dare you accuse me of such a horrible crime? How dare you make such aspersions about my character? So DDE stops that from being an issue, because you come from a place of developmental inquiry. So what is developmental inquiry? Well, developmental inquiry is simply saying, for my own development, I'd really like to understand, hence the IDU, I'd really like to understand your criteria for not giving me this job, or for not giving me this glam project, or for choosing someone else instead of me when we're doing exactly the same work. I'd really like to just understand, just for my own development, I'd really like to understand what led to you, or what were the criteria around that glam project. And usually when you come from a place of development, you tend to be dealing with a team leader, a manager, a director, a CEO, a chairman. So when you come from a place of developmental inquiry, you invoke their natural leadership skill, right? Which is development, which is coaching and development. So obviously they're going to respond positively. They're going to take a pastoral approach in terms of developing the person. So they're going to respond. It also bigs them up, so to speak. It's almost like, I need to learn from you. But you've got to come at it from a dispassionate perspective. If you come at it from any other perspective, it's not going to work for you. So you can't bring 400 years of slavery to the table. That's just not going to work for you. You can't bring the suffragette movement to the table. That's not going to work for you either. You can't bring homophobia issues to the table. That won't work either for you. Even if you have every right in the world to bring this baggage to the table, it's not going to help you from a results perspective. So what you need to do is drop the baggage, even though you have every right to have it, and come from a place of developmental inquiry. And let me tell you why you can do that. Because when you're coming from a place of developmental inquiry, you're starting to use your leadership skills. You actually see the bias, unconscious bias or reverse bias. You actually see it coming, and you actually take control of the situation. And taking control of the situation speaks to the leader in you. Sometimes the other side does, in most cases, the other side doesn't realize they're being biased, be it racial bias, sexual bias, or whatever it is. They don't realize it, but you can see it because you understand the nuances of conditioning, and you can see that they've been conditioned. So what you do is come at it. You make the decision to come at it from dispassionate developmental inquiry. You don't have to. I mean, if you're in the street and somebody annoys you, you might decide that you don't want to. But when you make a decision to come from a place of developmental inquiry, dispassionate developmental inquiry in dealing with bias, you're immediately taking control of the situation, and suddenly you're a leader. And you need to do this as a subject, but you also need to do this as a perpetrator when you're turned into a subject on reverse bias. And if more people could understand this skill, what you're going to find is that it naturally starts to dissipate, reduce unconscious bias in the moment. Because if it happens once and you interrupt the situation, that's going to send a message to the mind of the mindset of the person that was a perpetrator. And when it happens again, it's going to send another message. And what that's going to do is make them aware naturally. They're not going to have to read books on fragility in order to be aware of their unconscious bias or reverse bias, as the case may be. Because each time that you interrupt, you call out a bias statement or a bias microaggression, you're reconditioning the mind of the perpetrator. And when you recondition the mind of the perpetrator, they become aware. And the likelihood of this problem happening is significantly reduced. If you had everybody in an organization do that whenever they were confronted with any form of bias, over time, you would rapidly see a diminishing of this as an issue. And this drives productivity. It reduces time off work. It improves people's mental health. It stops drains on HR. You don't need a mediator. You're less likely to need safe spaces that you create for people to speak and empty their bag, all this built up tension, racial tension, sexism tension, ageism tension, and sexualism tension, ableism tension. All of these tensions build up because people don't know how to call it out. But if you can come from a place of, I don't understand, you can almost leave and leave the baggage in the lobby. And this is a choice that you make in the moment. Sometimes it's right to just let it go. But in most cases, if you can call it out without the baggage, what you're going to find is that over time, the baggage is going to disappear because you won't need the baggage. And you'll be in so much control that it'll allow you to expedite the pace at which you drive your career. Your career grows. And I think that's good for everyone.